Greetings. Welcome to End Times Radio with Bart
and Bob.
Our guest tonight is Michael Marcades. He is son of Rose CHERAMI, and he's the author of the book, Rose CHERAMI, Gathering Fallen Petals. And I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit about his book and put on the screen here. We have a link which will be in the description of this video where you can buy the book on Amazon, either a hard copy or, as it were, paperback, or Kindle, the new digital version. It says, on November 21st, 1963, just hours from Dallas, Texas, Rose CHERAMI was going through severe heroin withdrawal when she was admitted to a treatment facility. Once admitted, she proceeded to warn doctors, nurses, and fellow patients of President John F. Kennedy's impending death. She claimed to have been traveling on a drug run from Miami with two mean guys who were planning an attack on the president. An assassin killed President Kennedy the very next day. And Rose CHERAMI, Gathering Fallen Petals, Rose's only son, Michael Marcades, who we'll be interviewing, pieces together the fragments of Rose's troubled life involving substance abuse, prostitution, and violence to reveal startling truths about the events leading up to the assassination and what Rose may or may not have known. Based on true events, JFK Lancer's Gathering Fallen Petals is an incredible and historically accurate account of one woman's struggle to overcome her demons. And Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about Michael and what you know about him?
Well, Michael's story is fascinating, and it's so close. His mom is Rose CHERAMI, and as a journalist, or speaking to him, it puts me on two fronts. One, I'm interested in the story and how it plays into the Kennedy assassination, and on the other hand, he's a human being and a brother in the Lord, and he's had to live through this story. So, I pray and do my utmost to balance those two things, try to get the truth out, and also, this is a real murders involved in this story, certainly of the president, and so many witnesses have been, died under questionable circumstances. And Michael is someone who has some information that the major media has ignored, and I was fortunate enough to be able to hear back from him after I tried a couple of times without luck to contact him, and then we did make contact. And his story is fascinating and adds a real important piece to the Kennedy assassination story, and also his mom's story, which is very important in and of itself, and Michael's story, which is important in and of itself on so many levels. So we're grateful to have Michael here tonight.
Well, Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you into writing this book?
Well, thank you, Bart, and thank you, Bob, for having me on your show this evening. A little bit about my background. I am a professional musician. I have been for almost 4 decades now. I have been a professional trumpet player, trained classically, and at some point in my career made a transition to becoming a professional conductor. I've taught on the university level and presently teaching a 6A high school in Dallas. Excuse me, not in Dallas, but in Texas. I lived in the East Coast, Georgia and Alabama area for 12 years, but was not seeing my grandchildren near as much as I wanted, so I made a transition back to Texas. I'm also an ordained minister. I've spent over 30 years in music ministry, 15 years full-time, and 30 years part-time, while also taught on the university level. Prior to that, I was trained as a classically oriented professional trumpet player, played for over 25 years, and just probably 20 years ago when I went back to school to earn my PhD, kicked it under the bed and told it to stay there. So that's a little bit of background. I have 3 children. The oldest is 37 years old, did her master's degree in conducting with me at Columbus State, and now teaches high school in Georgia. I have a daughter and a son who live in Lubbock, Texas, just north of where I live now in Odessa. So I get to see them pretty often.
And how old were you at the time that your mother was in the hospital days before the JFK assassination?
Actually, I was in the 7th grade. Oh, excuse me, before the assassination, I was in the 5th grade. I remember the day explicitly as the announcement came over the system in my 5th grade classroom in Duncanville, Texas. So I was a 5th grader. I was probably 11 years old because I was about 13, almost 13 years old when Mother died.
So you have some pretty good memories of this event. And then what led you to writing the book, inspired you? And just go ahead and also tell us what the book is about.
Well, honestly, I never really dreamed that what I was writing would actually be published and sitting on the shelves at a Barnes & Noble. And the fact that it does is such an amazing blessing. It's hard for me to comprehend. The reason I tackled this project, and I do mean tackled, it's been 30 years. It took me 30 years to research fully my mother's story from beginning to end. And I've spent 10 years writing the manuscript. I've rewritten the manuscript itself completely on 4 separate occasions. But I didn't really write at the time to be published. I wrote to be connected with my mother, whom I barely knew, but what I did know about her was very special and very deep inside me. But there were so many, many things that neither I nor my family knew that I was determined to get to the bottom of it all. And so that's how the book really came to be.
And Bob, what would you have Michael share with us about this topic?
Well, Michael, I know that I'd been hearing some ripples coming through about Dr. Cyril Wecht, who was a critic of the Warren Commission and I believe also the House Select Committee, where he had been saying straight up that President Kennedy wasn't killed by a lone gunman. And he's, a high-profile fellow. He's been the president of the American Academy of Forensic Science and the American College of Legal Medicine. And the last time we spoke, we talked about the circumstances that took your mom's life.
Yes.
For which I grieve. Even when I mention it, I get a sadness at what she went through. But it seems that last time we talked that you had said in order to delve into that, we would need someone with the, the reputation and the ability of, say, a Cyril Wecht to step in and look at the autopsy and the circumstances your mom died. So with that being set up, could you describe, as you're comfortable, about how your mom, how they talked about her death, how you came to find some records after, digging by yourself for many years, and what's the new information about Dr. Wecht?
Absolutely. The first and probably most important thing that your listeners would probably like to know is that there are dozens of documents that I have in my possession that I have unearthed over the past 30 years. Many of them are contained in the book, but there are dozens beyond those printed in the book. One of the most important documents that I have yet to share with the world is the medical account, the 8.5 hours of medical care provided my mother in her final hours of life at Gladewater Hospital. What is in that document is quite profound. It much more than referring to an automobile accident refers very professionally to a wound to my mother's head that I have questioned for years, and I've repeatedly placed this document in the hands of professional physicians and asked them to interpret the words they find on the page. All of them have always responded with some kind of definition similar to mother was either shot in the head with close range connection, or that she was struck in the head with a large object that immediately was devastating to her physical reality. In recent days, last November, it was my privilege to meet Dr. Cyril Wecht as he was speaking at the JFK Lancer Conference in Dallas, Texas at the Adolphus Hotel. As your readers may not be aware that Cyril Wecht is probably one of the world's foremost forensic pathologists. And as you read just a little bit from his personal resume, he has had quite a year. I believe he's in his 80s now, but still very much alive and active and researching, all in confrontation of what I call the ridiculous story reported by the Warren Commission. In recent days, it has come to my attention that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of people who stay connected via the internet and discuss various aspects of Mother's life and her mysterious death. Recently, I was informed that the question came up about the nature of Mother's death. And remember, again, all of these questions arise from persons who have never even known about, or certainly never read, the medical report that I have had in my hands for over 25 years. I have kept it in my care for a reason, because I wanted to finish my research, I wanted to write my thoughts down, and now we're at a point where we can actually address the terminology contained therein in a very open way. However, in the past, though the physicians whom I've had read this document know what they were talking about, they certainly don't carry the weight that a Dr. Cyril Wecht does among the assassination community and indeed among the medical community worldwide. Recently, Dr. Wecht made a direct response in that blog tool to someone expressing doubt about the fact that Mother was injured by the punctate stellate wound described in that medical document. Cyril Wecht, though I have not talked to him personally, I do intend to ask him to go on record on my website with some kind of definitive description of those terms. I do know that he has read the document. I do know that he has defended what I have written in my book about the unusual nature of Mother's injuries, certainly not having anything directly to do with being run over by a car driven by Jerry Don Moore. So the document that I have in my hand, gentlemen, is a very important piece of this puzzle. And once I post it, and I intend to post documents soon on my website, rosecheramibook.com, that will support everything that I have written in my book. By the way, I have documentation in my possession that can support and does support everything I have written in relationship to Mother's life and the Kennedy assassination. None of it has been written down in a made-up fashion. It has all been based on documented fact.
Now, for the listener who might not have had a chance to read the book yet, Rose CHERAMI, Gathering Fallen Petals by Dr. Michael Marcades, could you give them a short overview of just, they can read the book and get into more facts, but just for the purposes of tonight listening to the show, just even in common sense, the story seems to really beg to be looked into, just the events that happened, when we lost your mom.
Yes, well, the goal of my book was to tell the entire picture from birth to her tragic death. Obviously, no one in the world was more qualified or even remotely qualified to do so, except me. And I could go on and on about the grocery sack full of documents, letters, etc., that was handed down to me when my grandparents died. That this grocery sack of documentation became the foundation for all of my research. But my goal of the book was to reach far beyond what the world knew about Rose CHERAMI, and to indeed add flesh to that character, to present her as daughter, sister, mother, friend, heroin addict, prostitute, informant for the FBI, all of those things, and of course, to discuss and present the facts of her tragic death and the cover-up of those facts for over 50 years.
Now, I understand that when Jim Garrison was investigating this several years after the assassination, he was trying to get your mother's body exhumed through the Texas police and they refused to cooperate. Would you, as her descendant, have the right to exhume her body? Has that been done, or would you consider doing that so that the skull could be examined to see if indeed there was a bullet wound there?
We have, Gary Shaw, my very close friend and world-respected first-generation researcher, and I have discussed this openly on several occasions, trying to determine if A, we could bring it about financially, and B, would it indeed add something to the picture? But I do understand exactly what you have said, and as her son, that would be the only reason that I would allow her body to be exhumed. She is right now resting in Wheatland Cemetery in the Duncanville, Texas area, an area that when Mother was buried was completely out in the country, but is now surrounded by buildings and cement. So if exhumation were to occur, I would certainly want to lay her to rest in somewhere more peaceful. But we have discussed it. I am open to it if someone like Cyril Wecht were to inform me that it would allow us to come to some definitive conclusions about the nature of her death. But at this point, we have not made plans to do so.
Yeah, it seems to me that would be very good evidence that's at hand, ready to be brought up, that could be definitive. And yet, before this interview, I was thinking, it seems like no matter what evidence comes up, nothing's going to change the false narrative of history. I mean, if the public didn't care enough in 1963 to override the Warren Commission, then they certainly don't care now. I mean, if the truth really couldn't come out then people care even less now. Nevertheless, who knows what government will have 50 years, 100 years from now. Maybe there'll be this whole, digging up of the history of the moon landings, the JFK assassination, fluoridation of water, chemtrails, and all that. Maybe there'll be, a reestablishment of the truth. I don't know. But it seems to me there is that evidence there at hand that could be brought up, and you just never know what else you might find.
You do never know. And just to respond to your comment about people caring or not, of course, every year that passes, every decade that passes, removes us from people who actually want to know true answers. And as a public educator in Texas, every day I encounter young people who many of them seem to have very little interest in history or any of the events surrounding the Kennedy assassination, how it might have impacted their lives more than they could ever imagine, or they don't even seem to have much interest in getting to the truth. So, I don't know that I'm extremely hopeful about what actions might be taken with any evidence that might be turned up 25, 30, 40, 50 years from now. I just know that there are hundreds, thousands, of people who are still alive today, some of them in their 80s and 90s, who want to know the truth.
Well,
in this case, I'm sorry, Bart, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to say the Kennedy assassination files from, I think, a late 1990s congressional ruling are alleged to be opened this year. And then, of course, there's a little asterisk by that, unless the current president at that time decides to postpone them indefinitely. So it's really, I don't know, it's kind of a weird law to say we're definitely going to open the files unless we change our mind. Do you think Trump is going to open them up? And if so, what might be in there?
I have no idea. Bob, do you have some comment on that?
Well, for what it's worth, I started with humbly. I've looked into it for 30 years, and I find that even if the exhumation happened, which is a very personal thing for you to go through, and they determined the cause of death being a gunshot, that I suspect the next move by the forces that have covered this up at every step will simply say, okay, the person who was running drugs was shot.
Yes.
What does this have to do with Kennedy? She was, hallucinating in the hospital, and they watered the story down and turn it and twist it in the worst possible light. We've seen it time after time. So that would be my concern. I say if tomorrow we got that verdict and it would mean something to someone who's researched it for so long, that would still be twisted and put in a different context by the people, I think, who've gone to cover this up from day one. I think it was the crime was powerful and then it killed Kennedy, but the cover-up's been very sloppy. It's just been very violent. It's sort of been done by brown shirt thugs who, so many witnesses who disappeared. Now they're saying Dorothy Kilgallen, the reporter. It seems they've now opened her case again in New York, and she had been interviewing Jack Ruby, and I wanted to ask you about that. Just to put it in context, who were the people your mom was in contact with who give, not only was she in the hospital and someone might allege, oh, she was ranting, but who was it that she knew that shows she wasn't just an ordinary person?
Well, please forgive my redundancy. I just want your listeners to understand that I have proof. I have documents that prove that she knew and was in connection with and worked for Jack Ruby. And prior to that time, she was involved in all of the drug activities out of New Orleans, reaching from Dallas all the way to Miami, all the way into the southeastern states. She did it for years. She also knew about the connection between Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald. I have documents where she has stated such. And, the fact that she was coming down off of heroin at the time that she was speaking to Lieutenant Francis Frugier, who was one of the most respected state police officials in Louisiana, with specification in narcotics. Frugier had the ability to look through the screen door, if you understand what I'm saying. He had dealt with so many people in their retraction from the impacts of serious drugs like heroin that he knew how to listen and how to use his eyes and discern between that which was impacted by drugs and that which was rooted in truth. And that is precisely why he listened carefully to Mother. He knew at the time that he was encountering her, though some of her behaviors were indeed erratic and very odd. At the times when she was most lucid, she was speaking clearly and accounting facts that she knew to be true.
And how many people did she recount this in front of? This would have happened on November 20th, I believe. And then in the hospital, how many people would have heard her talk about the events to come before President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas?
Well, I guess my only fair response to that would be numerous, because she was openly addressing what was occurring in what would be called the public gathering room in the hospital where she was staying. Not doctors heard her, nurses heard her. Many of them have actually gone on record. In fact, this evening, I have in my hand a couple of memorandum from 1967 addressed directly to Jim Garrison, wherein individuals like A.H. Magruder are addressing what they learned from others about Mother's speaking and talking about what she knew was going to occur and what was occurring indeed on that tragic day.
Well, I think if someone who was previously claimed to have been killed by an automobile around the time, who's on the record is saying she knew about the Kennedy assassination before it happened, if exhumed and it is proved that the cause of death is a gunshot wound to the head instead, and she also has ties to the person who assassinated the assassin, Jack Ruby, then yes. I think that gunshot wound to the head is not random. It's definitely tied in.
Absolutely. Recently, one of my friends and colleagues with the JFK Lancer conference, Larry Hancock, made a presentation that I'd like to share some of it with you. When he was talking about why Mother was a legitimate person to be listened to. And one of the things, he listed several things in his presentation that I think your audience might find interesting. Number one, he said that Rose, my mother, indeed did work out of Dallas and was acting as a bona fide drug carrier and prostitute, exactly as she stated. Her arrest record confirms that she carried quantities of drugs and drug payments back and forth across the country, as she stated. She was associated with vice bosses and their street men, exactly as she stated. She provided information to Frege about a major drug deal in that November that was all fully verified, down to the sailor who was on the ship involved in the drug transaction. She obviously said she had a child named Michael, who was in danger of those with whom at least she believed I was in danger of being threatened if she did not do as they asked. Her pre-assassination warnings are confirmed by multiple people, indeed probably dozens of people, including law enforcement, and that the Louisiana police verified her associations of prior association with Jack Ruby in Dallas. I mean, all of this has been proven true. That not one thing did she say that anyone has been able to prove was a lie.
I think, Bob, you had another question for Michael.
Yes, I was fascinated by the book. Again, I want to mention the title, Rose CHERAMI, Gathering Fallen Petals by Dr. Michael Marcades. And just one thing I wanted to introduce before I ask the question is, many people laugh and say, well, who killed Kennedy? Was it the mafia? Was it, agents? Was it the FBI? And the funny thing is, how could they all get together, and they laugh at it, but that was the apparatus basically that was working to try to take out Fidel Castro. And those people turned on Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis, and, looked at him as very weak, if not a traitor. If you hear how some of these people reacted, especially if you look into Doug Horn's work, I want to plug that. He did some great work on that. But it's not far-fetched that we're already trying to kill Fidel Castro. And if that apparatus was turned on Kennedy, it was already in place. And I'm not saying that's the answer. And I know that Dr. Marcades is very careful when he draws conclusions. So I want to move back to his thoughts, but I just wanted to throw that in. We were talking about your mom's story bearing out and being true. And I just wanted to move into the truth. A great person for the truth is Gary Shaw, who I respect very much from his work. And I just wanted to ask how you became involved with him, how he helped you, and how he helped develop leads in the case.
Well, yes, Gary is a very dear person in my life. We've known each other now for at least 25, 30 years. I first met Gary, actually maybe longer than that. I first met Gary when I was in college at Baylor University. I received a phone call from my aunt and uncle in North Dallas telling me that a man named Gary Shaw was reporting some information about my mother's death and that they wanted us to all meet. And so I made arrangements to leave Baylor to drive to North Dallas, and that is the day I met Gary Shaw in my aunt and uncle's home in North Dallas. And that is the first day that I truly believe my family gathered in that room, my aunt and uncle, that's the first day that we learned anything definitively about the mysterious death of my mother. I did not realize it at the time. That I believe I was probably 20 or 21 years old. I had no idea how important that day would be. And I had no idea how important my connection with Gary Shaw would be in the future. Gary is my spiritual brother. I don't know how many times I've called Gary and just asked for his prayers and his loving support, because this entire process of researching Mother's life has been very difficult. Facing some of these hard truths, for a son to face all of the facts that I've discovered, I think anyone would be hard pressed to say that it would not be difficult. And at times, I've not been completely okay. The thought of knowing that my mother was removed from this world illegally, regardless of her station in life, a murder is never okay. And so Gary has been a huge support to me. In not necessarily in the writing process, because I don't think Gary knew that I was writing until I was almost finished. But he has been so encouraging and held me up, as has Chris Gallup, a dear friend of Gary Shaw's. In fact, if it weren't for Chris Gallup, I don't believe Deborah Conway would have ever had the opportunity to read my manuscript. So both of those gentlemen are very important to me. Both are Christians. Gary has really held me up at times when I felt like I could barely stand, to be truthful.
Now, he helped you find some of the documents at the hospital. Could you tell us how that came about?
Yes, that was a very interesting day. Gary and my lawyer proceeded to Gladewater Hospital, and I took with me, of course, all the proper documentation to justify my demanding the medical reports from Gladewater Hospital. Oddly, it took hours for me to get those documents, even with Gary and my lawyer in tow as her sole son. It was a very odd experience that I will never, ever forget. In fact, and I don't mean to sound mystic, but I remember walking to that hospital and feeling a presence from my mother that I had never, ever felt anywhere else on earth. I don't know how to explain it. And again, I don't mean to sound mystical, but I felt her presence in that building as being the last place that she breathed. And it took almost 5 hours for me to get those documents out of the hands of that hospital. And, you would think that documents would have been housed in a file cabinet, in a folder, in a file cabinet. Well, let me tell you, that is not where my mother's records were pulled from. I was watching as the administrative attendant pulled my mother's medical records from a folder stuck behind a desk up against the wall in that records room. I'll never forget thinking how odd that was, but it wouldn't be till decades later that I would really ponder the seriousness of the location of those records. But that was a day I will never forget.
And what did you learn from those records?
Well, number one, it helped me piece together some oddities. In the grocery sack that I talked about earlier, there were 2 original death certificates in that grocery sack. 2. I don't know how unusual that is, but I do know that on both of them, the letters DOA were clearly stamped, implying that my mother was dead when she arrived at the hospital. Well, the records that I received at the end of that 5-hour period in that hospital provided, as I've said, almost 9 hours of minute-by-minute medical care, including the setting of an arm, a limb. Why would the hospital go to the trouble to take care of a broken bone of a person who was deceased? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. And of course, the narrative in that medical document is exact actions taken by the doctors, by the nurses, every drug that was administered, her reaction to it, her physical condition, all of it is right there. And again, that's a document that the world has yet to see, but I will be posting it on my website soon.
It sounds to me like there's a possibility she could have even been murdered at the hospital. Who's to say that the gun wound didn't happen at the hospital? It's like with Oswald, when he was shot by Jack Ruby, how do we know that wound was lethal? Just because they tell us so? Maybe on the operating table, the CIA came in, flashed their badges, and said, do not administer any surgical procedures to him so that he will die. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, this is very interesting that you bring up this possibility, because at the very end of this medical documentation, my mother was administered at a time when her blood pressure was extremely low. She was administered an excessively high dosage of a drug. Shortly after that administration, mother was no longer breathing. And I have yet been, up to date, I have never been able to find anyone to justify the administration of that high drug dosage at that time, especially giving her physical signs at the moment. That is something that nobody in the world has heard about except Gary Shaw. There's only 2 people, now 3, to whom I have shown this document. And of course, I've now shared it with Sarah Wecht. But up until that point, Gary Shaw, Chris Gallup, and Deborah Conway were the only persons with whom I've directly shared this document. But it is very interesting to me that mother was administered a high dosage of a drug that seems to make no sense at all. And shortly thereafter, she was dead.
Well, that would explain then why they called her DOA when she wasn't. They would be covering up a homicide at the hospital.
Yes.
Can you tell me, what is your spiritual point of view of this? I mean, I'm known for being the journalist who exposed that the moon landings were fake. And one of the things that motivated me year after year, decade after decade, in my investigation into this topic was that I was just doing the initial investigation under the possibility that the moon landings might have been fake, because I realized if they were faked, if they were falsified after boasting, the Tower of Babel to reach the heavens, and boasting of the Titanic, the ship that who could not sink, and then Nixon saying putting a man on the moon was the greatest event since creation itself, that if such an event were falsified, that would actually be more historic of an event than if they had actually gone. I mean, think about it. They could either go to the moon and they could pull it off on the first attempt with 60s technology, even though they can't do it today, or they lied about it because of mankind's pride and depravity and greed and dark nature. That event being true, the faking of the moon landing, to me is more significant than if they had actually gone. And so we have this great truth that mankind is so wicked that we fake the moon landing and lie to scientists, lie to professors, lie to aerospace engineers, lie to the history books, for it. It's such a profound event. In this case, the JFK assassination, which was done by the same people who later faked the moon landing. You know what I mean? It's the same, I hate to say the word evil people, because we're all evil, all fallen short of the grace of God. Maybe the better word is unrepentant people, because the 3 of us are evil and repentant. I don't mind saying, but these unrepentant people are doing things like JFK and Vietnam War, staging all of these events. And your investigation into your mother's homicide and the JFK homicide, what's your take as to what this all means from a spiritual point of view?
Well, I'm deeply moved by what you just shared. I don't think I've heard anyone state it any more clearly. But in regards to my spiritual life, I have been a Christian for a very long time. I came to know Jesus as my Savior at a very young age. I remember the moment. I remember standing in the pew as a child. I remember being moved by the Spirit, and without any fanfare or announcement or requesting of permission, I stepped out into the aisle and accepted Jesus as my Savior. And that was the beginning of a journey that has allowed me to survive all this. If you read my book, you will learn of some events that have occurred in my life, like being left alone by my mother at the age of 4 or 4.5 in a filthy, roach-infested apartment in Houston, Texas, and my grandparents being led by God to get in the car, drive to Houston in search of their daughter. They had no idea where she was. They had no idea where I was. they drive into Houston and miraculously locate my mother plying her trade on the corner. Mother waves them down, jumps in the car, and says she says, I must take you to Michael immediately. My grandparents go with their daughter to this roach-infested apartment, and there I am sitting in the middle of the floor, completely unattended, at the age of 4 or 4.5. And that is the day that my grandparents rescued me, and with permission from my mom, because my mom at that point realized that she had no business trying to raise me, and that for my benefit, that she needed to turn me over to my grandparents. I'm telling you that in my mind is nothing less than God leading my grandparents to a point in Houston so that I could be rescued. You know, and in this entire story, retelling, discovering, researching, and telling this story, there have been times when the only reason I could continue to write was because of God's strength and power, and the acknowledgement that though I don't have a rap sheet like my mother had, I'm not a heroin addict, I have not been involved in activities like prostitution. Nevertheless, I have sinned. And as I understand God's word, it's not the nature, the kind of sin that matters. It is that there is sin present, period. And that the only reason we are still living and breathing and have any hope is the grace that has been offered to us through the crucified and risen Christ. End of discussion.
Well, tell us about, but we'll be wrapping up soon. Tell us about what you do now and your music ministry.
Well, actually, I'm not actively involved in music ministry at the moment. I did it for 30 years. And then, of course, I've taught on the university level for 20 years, almost 20 years. And right now I'm teaching 6A high school, which in and of itself is truly a ministry to a generation of students that many of them, I believe, who simply have lost their way and who are in desperate need of Jesus Christ in their life. And in spite of the fact that I teach in a public paradigm, I work every day to share who I am in Jesus with these students in a roundabout way, and honestly, some days on a very direct level, because I know they are in desperate need of Jesus.
Well, I don't want you to underestimate the influence of that, Michael. For example, when my parents were going through a divorce, I was at age 14, and all of my friends' parents were going through a divorce. It was like a fad at the time. And in every single case, it was like just, standard operating procedure that the dad would leave and go off with his girlfriend, and the mom would be stuck with the kids. And then I had a history teacher, and he fought for custody of his children. And he gave me a ride home one day. I used to hitchhike to and from school because I hated the bus. And he told me he fought for custody of his kids. And I remember what a dramatic impact that had on me for years to come, to know that there are men out there who are good fathers, who want to be good fathers, who would fight for custody of their kids during a divorce. And that had a great impact on me. And then years later, a friend of mine's younger brother said he was in that teacher's class. And of course, I got an F in that class because I refused to do any work as a protest of public schools. Another story. But he said he talks about Bart all the time, about how this high school, college dropout went on to become a filmmaker and all this stuff. So it's interesting. He had an impact on my life, and then he would go and share how, you can be an oddball and still succeed in his classroom. So don't underestimate the impact of those little relationships, those few words of encouragement that you give to somebody, some young person, that can have an impact on their life for decades to come.
I do understand that, and indeed I had men in my life who took that place. My music minister during my high school years at First Baptist Church, Duncanville, Texas, Gilbert Davis, my band director who forged a direction for my career. And honestly, someone who very seldom comes up in a discussion, my father, whom I found at the age when I was 38 years old. My dad told a story that no one in my family bothered to tell, and that was that he was forbidden access to me in my lifetime following the divorce, something my family failed to tell me. It would have been nice to know. But my father, you know, just such, I'll never forget the day I met him in the airport, so kind of hovering over in the corner, very unassuming man, tender. It was something that I'll never forget. And uniquely, talk about miracles, my father died of a brain tumor 6 months after I found him.
Well, it looks like God provided the opportunity for you two to be reconciled.
Yes.
Well, here's one of your songs I thought we would end with. Sing to the Lord a New Song. There'll be a link for this also in the description of the video. We'll even throw up a little bit of a picture. Is this you conducting?
Yes, it is, and that is my choir that I conducted at Columbus State University. I taught there for almost 7 years, and I'll never forget that choir. It was an awesome performance.
Well, we thank you very much, Michael, for being on the show, and this has been End Times Radio with Bart.
And Bob.
And we thank you for joining, and be sure to stay tuned for next week's episode.
With my mother, whom I barely knew, but what I did know about her was very special and very deep inside me. But there were so many things that neither I nor my family knew that I was determined to get to the bottom of it all. And so that's how the book really came to be.
And Bob, what would you have Michael share with us about this topic?
Well, Michael, I know that I'd been hearing some ripples coming through about Dr. Cyril Wecht, who was a critic of the Warren Commission and I believe also the House Select Committee, where he had been saying straight up that President Kennedy wasn't killed by a lone gunman. And he's, you know, a high-profile fellow. He's been the president of the American Academy of Forensic Science and the American College of Legal Medicine. And the last time we spoke, we talked about the circumstances that took your mom's life.
Yes.
You know, for which I grieve. You know, even when I mention it, I get a sadness at what she went through. But it seems that last time we talked that you had said in order to delve into that, we would need someone with the, you know, the reputation and the ability of, say, a Cyril Wecht to step in and look at the autopsy and the circumstances your mom died. So with that being set up, could you describe, as you're comfortable, about how...
Background, I am a professional musician. I have been for almost 4 decades now. I have been a professional trumpet player, trained classically, and at some point in my career made a transition to becoming a professional conductor. I've taught on the university level and presently teaching 6A high school in Dallas. Excuse me, not in Dallas, but in Texas. I lived in the East Coast, Georgia and Alabama area for 12 years, but was not seeing my grandchildren near as much as I wanted, so I made a transition back to Texas. I'm also an ordained minister. I've spent over 30 years in music ministry, 15 years full-time, and 30 years part-time, while I also taught on the university level. Prior to that, I was trained as a classically oriented professional trumpet player, played for over 25 years, and just probably 20 years ago when I went back to school to earn my PhD, kicked it under the bed and told it to stay there. So that's a little bit of background. I have 3 children. The oldest is 37 years old, did her master's degree in conducting with me at Columbus State and now teaches high school in Georgia. I have a daughter and a son who live in Lubbock, Texas, just north of where I live now in Odessa. So I get to see them pretty often.
And how old were you at the time that your mother was in the Greetings. Welcome to End Times Radio with Bart
and Bob.
Our guest tonight is Michael Marcades. He is son of Rose CHERAMI, and he's the author of the book, Rose CHERAMI, Gathering Fallen Petals. And I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit about his book and put on the screen here. We have a link which will be in the description of this video where you can buy the book on Amazon, either a hard copy or, as it were, paperback or Kindle, the new digital version. It says, on November 21st, 1963, just hours from Dallas, Texas, Rose CHERAMI was going through severe heroin withdrawal when she was admitted to a treatment facility. Once admitted, she proceeded to warn doctors, nurses, and fellow patients of President John F. Kennedy's impending death. She claimed to have been traveling on a drug run from Miami with two mean guys who were planning an attack on the president. An assassin killed President Kennedy the very next day. And Rose CHERAMI, Gathering Fallen Petals, Rose's only son, Michael Marcades, who we'll be interviewing, pieces together the fragments of Rose's troubled life involving substance abuse, prostitution, and violence to reveal startling truths about the events leading up to the assassination and what Rose may or may not have known. Based on true events, JFK Lancer's Gathering Fallen Petals is an incredible and historically accurate hospital days before the JFK assassination.
Actually, I was in the 7th grade. Oh, excuse me, before the assassination, I was in the 5th grade. I remember the day explicitly as the announcement came over the system in my 5th grade classroom in Duncanville, Texas. So I was a 5th grader. I was probably 11 years old because I was about 13, almost 13 years old when Mother died.
So you have some pretty good memories of this event. And then what led you to writing the book, inspired you? And just go ahead and also tell us what the book is about. Well,
honestly, I never really dreamed that what I was writing would actually be published and sitting on the shelves at a Barnes & Noble. And the fact that it does is such an amazing blessing. It's hard for me to comprehend. The reason I tackled this project, and I do mean tackled, it's been 30 years. It took me 30 years to research fully my mother's story from beginning to end. And I've spent 10 years writing the manuscript. I've rewritten the manuscript itself completely on 4 separate occasions. But I didn't really write at the time to be published. I wrote to be connected.
Count a one-woman struggle to overcome her demons. And Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about Michael and what you know about him?
Well, Michael's story is fascinating, and it's so close. His mom is Rose CHERAMI, and as a journalist, or speaking to him, it puts me on 2 fronts. One, I'm interested in the story and how it plays into the Kennedy assassination, and on the other hand, he's a human being and a brother in the Lord, and he's, had to live through this story. So, I pray and do my utmost to balance those 2 things, try to get the truth out, and also, this is a real murders involved in this story, certainly of the president, and so many witnesses have been, died under questionable circumstances. And Michael is someone who has some information that the major media has ignored, and I was fortunate enough to be able to hear back from him after I tried a couple of times without luck to contact him, and then we did make contact. And his story is fascinating and adds a real important piece to the Kennedy assassination story, and also his mom's story, which is very important in and of itself, and Michael's story, which is important in and of itself on so many levels. So we're grateful to have Michael here tonight.
Well, Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you into writing this book?
Well, thank you, Bart, and thank you, Bob, for having me on your show this evening. A little bit about my background.